Hello, I'm Daniela Mellen. In today's video, we're continuing the slow stitching series, adding textured elements to our pieces. Now these are just different ways to manipulate fabric using thread, fabric, and maybe some other supplies to add interesting depth to your pieces. In today's video, I'm going to show how I embed some yarn into my piece. But you don't have to stop with yarn. You can embed almost anything. String, little sticks, bamboo skewers, toothpicks, you get the idea. And so this is the process that I use to do that. So to create the texture that we have here in this sample, we're not creating this texture, this cut texture, but this one instead of this embedded texture. And I think it's kind of interesting. It really changes depending on the fabric that you use, the color of your stitches, and the thickness of these little channels that you embed on your work. So to show you how to do just this type of embedding process, I have my tag, and then you need some type of cording or yarn. It obviously comes in different thicknesses, from really thin, which you could make very detailed and fine little channels, to this beautiful thick one. And that's what I'm going to use today. It shows up on camera, but I love that chunky look, that texture. And again, modify this according to what you want in your work. So the first thing I do is I set out how many little channels I want to make. I look for some pieces of the yarn that don't really have those major kinks in them. It's just harder to work with. So I'll clip them off, and then I'll make maybe 3 or 4 of these little pieces here. And I like them to hang off my tag, my work. I think that little bit that hangs off is kind of intriguing in itself. So I have my channels set up, and then I need a piece of fabric to overlay. It could be transparent, it could be netting, tulle. This is just cotton. And I cut it far longer than I plan on using for this tag. So I'm going to just lay my fabric over my little textured pieces here and just roughly figure out that I have enough fabric, and I do. I'm going to just move it down a little further down the tag just because it's easier for me to handle and to store, because this is a reference piece. So I'll stick my first little strip here. Then I'm just going to take my needle and thread and just tack a couple of stitches just to hold it in place. And I like to go at the ends. I don't want to go through the thread, the yarn. I just want to go around it. So I bring my needle and thread up, and then I come down on the other side like a couching stitch. And I can do this as many times as I want, and I can alternate the position of the yarn as well. But for my tool here, I'm just going to go with straight lines across. So I'll just go 2 or 3 stitches across the length of this yarn to hold it in place. And when I'm happy that it's secure, I'll do this with the remaining pieces. Again, just placing them down, taking my needle and thread and tacking them in position. So there I have my yarn tacked down. Now that in itself is an interesting texture, so you of course could stop there, and you could vary the colors of the thread as well as the yarn in the background for various effects. But because I want to embed it, I'm going to take my fabric here, figure out where I want it, and then really play up the texture of this yarn, this little roll here that it makes. So I'll just play around. I'm not going to iron it or anything. I'll just really finger press the fabric into that position. I'll take my thread and I'll start right at the top, right above this yarn. And I'm just going to do a straight stitch all the way across. Again, I don't want to go through the yarn. I just want to come up and really help the fabric press up against the yarn. And it won't show through right away. It will require that pressure of the yarn and the fabric on the other side but you start to see this texture emerge. You can use any type of stitch that you'd like here. I'm just using a straight stitch because it parallels the yarn and it's easy. Plus, depending on the length of the stitch, the size of the space between stitches, you get a lot of play for such a simple stitch. So I'll stitch all the way across, and I like to go really towards the end here, right to the end of my fabric piece. So now I want to really emphasize this yarn that we added. So I'll play up by finger pressing using my nails to really emphasize that. And then when I have that in well, I'll come up from the bottom here and make another line of stitches. Again, avoiding the yarn itself, but just the fabric. So I'm stitching down here using the same stitch. Of course, you can vary the stitch as you like. You can make the fabric as tight or as loose at this point as well. Go right to the end of this row. And then I'll continue this all the way down the piece, stitching around each one of these pieces of yarn. So I stitched all those little yarn pieces. I didn't stitch through them, I stitched around them, creating those little channels that embed them on the tag. Now I'm just going to clip off some of this fabric. And I have a little sample here of an inspiration piece for me if I'm looking for something in my slow stitching, so that I can embed yarn or cording, maybe ribbon, shoelace, something like that into my work. So now I can just take my tag and add it to the piece, and my reference materials are starting to come together. So that's how I embed the yarn into my project. By repeating it, you get the element of additional lines, which creates additional texture, and the lines are something unique on their own. I hope you enjoyed this and it inspired you. And if you did, please hit the like button and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.